The string quartet stopped playing. 400 wedding guests turned to stare. I was wearing my husband's funeral dress to my son's wedding, and he had no idea I was coming. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever been betrayed by the person you love most? Have you ever felt completely erased from someone's life? Because that's exactly what happened to me, Eleanor, a 67-year-old mother from Scottsdale, Arizona, who discovered her only child was getting married through a Facebook post. The air in that ballroom was thick with the scent of white lilies and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers dripped light across marble floors, and every surface gleamed like something out of a magazine. This wasn't just any wedding, this was a monument to wealth and power, the kind of place where ordinary people like me simply don't belong. My navy blue dress, the same one I'd worn to Bob's funeral 3 years earlier, felt like armor against the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits surrounding me. Every step sent sharp pain through my arthritic knees, but the burning anger in my chest kept me moving forward. I clutched my simple black purse with white knuckles, feeling completely out of place yet absolutely determined. The guests' conversations died to whispers as I walked deeper into the ballroom. I could feel their eyes following me, their silent questions hanging in the air like smoke. Who was this woman? Why was she here? And most importantly, why did she look so angry? I scanned the room until my eyes found him. Michael. My son. My only child. The boy I'd raised, sacrificed for, loved unconditionally for 32 years. He stood near a massive ice sculpture of 2 swans, his arm wrapped around a woman in the most beautiful wedding dress I'd ever seen. Jessica. The woman who had stolen my son's heart and apparently convinced him I was no longer worth remembering. Michael was laughing at something someone had said, a genuine sound of joy that I hadn't heard from him in months. For a split second, seeing him happy made my heart flutter with that old maternal pride. But then reality crashed back down. This was his wedding day, and he hadn't even told me it was happening. Then he looked up. Our eyes met across that crowded ballroom, and I watched the color drain from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His smile vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of pure terror. His mouth fell open slightly, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who used to get caught sneaking cookies before dinner. The woman beside him, Jessica, followed his gaze, and her sharp green eyes narrowed when they landed on me. Even from across the room, I could see her jaw tighten, her perfect composure flickering for just an instant before snapping back into place. The music had stopped completely now. The entire ballroom had fallen into the kind of silence you only hear in nightmares, heavy, suffocating, and filled with unspoken tension. Hundreds of strangers stared at me like I was some kind of ghost who had wandered into their perfect celebration. Michael started moving toward me, his steps unsteady and jerky. I could see panic written across every line of his face. He was afraid, but afraid of what? Of me? Of causing a scene? Or of something much deeper that I hadn't yet discovered? Mom, he whispered when he got close enough, his voice barely audible above the shocked murmur that was beginning to ripple through the crowd. What are you doing here? I stood my ground, looking up at this man who used to be my little boy, feeling my heart break all over again. I came for answers, Michael. I came to understand how my own son could plan the most important day of his life and forget I exist. Jessica appeared beside him like a beautiful, dangerous shadow. Her wedding dress probably cost more than my car, and her smile was as cold as winter morning. Mrs. Patterson, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. What a surprise. The way she said my name made my skin crawl. It wasn't respectful or welcoming. It was dismissive, like she was addressing a servant who had overstepped their bounds. Yes, I replied, meeting her stare with steel in my own voice. I imagine it is. But what I discovered that night wasn't just about a wedding invitation. What I uncovered in that ballroom would shake the foundation of everything Michael thought he knew about the woman he was marrying, and it would expose a web of lies so twisted that even I couldn't have imagined it when I first stepped through those doors. The real question wasn't why I hadn't been invited to this wedding. The real question was whether this wedding should be happening at all. But to understand how I ended up in that ballroom, wearing my grief like armor, you need to know who Michael and I used to be together. You need to understand what we lost. 32 years ago, I held a screaming, red-faced baby in my arms and promised him the world. Bob and I lived in a modest ranch house in Scottsdale, where the desert sun painted everything golden and life moved at a gentler pace. Michael grew up in that house, in those sun-soaked rooms filled with laughter and unconditional love. Saturday mornings meant Little League games. I can still picture 7-year-old Michael in his oversized uniform, dirt smudged across his cheek, running toward me after every game win or lose, with that gap-toothed grin that could light up the entire stadium. Bob would ruffle his hair and say, "That's my boy." But Michael would always look to me first, seeking that maternal approval that meant everything to his young heart. Those were the days when bedtime stories stretched into deep conversations about his dreams. He wanted to be an astronaut, then a firefighter, then a businessman like his dad. "Mom," he'd whisper in the darkness of his bedroom, "do you think I can really do anything?" And I'd smooth his hair back and tell him that with love and determination, there were no limits to what he could achieve. The teenage years brought their challenges, but we weathered them together. When other parents complained about their sullen, uncommunicative teenagers, I counted my blessings. Michael still talked to me. He still sought my advice about friends, about school, about girls. We had something special, something precious that I thought would last forever. Have you ever watched someone you love slowly become a stranger? Because that's what started happening 3 years ago, though I didn't recognize it at first. Bob's heart attack came without warning. One moment we were planning our retirement, talking about traveling to see Michael more often in Chicago. The next moment, I was a widow at 64, staring at an empty house that suddenly felt enormous and suffocatingly quiet all at once. The grief was overwhelming, but Michael became my lifeline. He called every single night, sometimes talking for hours just to fill the silence that Bob's absence had created. "I'm here, Mom," he'd say when the tears came unexpectedly during our conversations. "You're not alone. You'll never be alone as long as I'm breathing." He flew home for the funeral, held my hand during the service, and stayed an extra week to help me sort through Bob's things. When he finally had to return to Chicago for work, he hugged me tight and whispered, "You're my rock, Mom. You always have been. Now let me be yours." Michael became my purpose, my reason for getting up each morning. His success at the investment firm filled me with pride. His apartment in that gleaming high-rise overlooking the Chicago River represented all the dreams we'd nurtured during those bedtime conversations years earlier. When he sent pictures, I'd study every detail, imagining his life in that sophisticated world so different from our desert home. Do you know what it feels like when your own child becomes too busy for you? When the person who promised you'd never be alone starts treating you like an interruption. The changes crept in so gradually that I convinced myself I was imagining them. The nightly phone calls became every other night, then twice a week, then just Sundays. "Sorry, Mom, I've got back-to-back meetings," became his standard greeting. "Can I call you later?" But later rarely came. That's when Jessica's name started appearing in our shortened conversations. "Jessica thinks I should redecorate my living room." "Jessica and I tried this new restaurant downtown." Jessica got promoted to senior marketing director at her company. Always Jessica, 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 like she'd become the sun around which his entire world revolved. I tried to be supportive, the way any mother should be when her son finds someone special. I asked questions about her, encouraged him to bring her home for a visit, sent care packages addressed to both of them. But Michael seemed uncomfortable whenever I showed too much interest in their relationship. "She's very career-focused, Mom," he'd say when I suggested they visit Scottsdale. "She doesn't really do the small-town thing." Or, "Jessica's family has different traditions. She's not big on meeting parents yet." Red flags that I should have recognized were waving right in front of me. But love makes you blind sometimes. I wanted my son to be happy, so I convinced myself that Jessica's reluctance to meet me was just modern dating culture, something I didn't understand because Bob and I had married young in a different era. The physical pain started around the same time the emotional distance grew. My arthritis, which had been manageable for years, suddenly flared with a vengeance. My knuckles swelled until I could barely hold a coffee cup. My knees ached constantly, making simple tasks like grocery shopping exhausting ordeals. Some mornings, I'd sit on the edge of my bed, staring at my swollen hands and wondering if this was what growing old alone looked like. The pain in my joints seemed to echo the deeper ache in my chest, the growing certainty that I was losing my son to a woman I'd never even met. The weekly phone calls dwindled to brief text messages. Busy week. Talk soon. Everything's fine here. Hope you're well. Generic responses that told me nothing about his life, his feelings, his world that was clearly expanding beyond anything that included me. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that like button and let me know in the comments, because what happened next changed everything. I was scrolling through social media on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, my swollen fingers struggling with the phone screen, when Martha's post appeared in my feed. Martha, my neighbor and longtime friend, beaming beside her husband at some elegant event. The caption made my blood freeze. An evening of elegance. So excited for Michael and Jessica. She tagged my son in dozens of photos, him in an expensive tuxedo, her in a designer gown that probably cost more than my monthly budget. They were on a yacht, surrounded by people I didn't recognize, celebrating something that looked suspiciously like an engagement party. My hands trembled as I scrolled through image after image of my son's life, a life I knew nothing about. The hashtag at the bottom of Martha's post felt like a knife twisting in my chest. That's when I realized the horrible truth. My son wasn't just distant. He was planning a wedding, and somehow, I wasn't invited to my own child's most important day. My arthritic fingers fumbled across the phone screen as I clicked on that hashtag, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. What I found in those search results shattered every remaining piece of the relationship I thought I still had with my son. Photo after photo filled my screen. Michael and Jessica at a wine tasting in Napa Valley, her left hand prominently displaying a diamond ring that caught the California sunlight like captured fire. The two of them at what looked like a formal engagement dinner, surrounded by people in expensive suits and cocktail dresses, all raising champagne glasses in celebration. There were pictures from a bridal shower, Jessica opening gifts, while a room full of perfectly dressed women watched and applauded. Flower arrangements taller than I am. A cake decorated with real gold leaf. Everything dripped with the kind of wealth I'd only seen in magazines. But it was the venue photos that truly broke my heart. A sprawling country club with manicured gardens and a ballroom that looked like something from a fairy tale. The caption read, "Scouting our dream venue." Posted 3 months ago. 3 months. He'd been planning this elaborate celebration for months while letting me believe our relationship was just going through a rough patch. My hands shook so violently that I nearly dropped the phone. The swelling in my knuckles made it painful to grip, but I couldn't stop scrolling. I needed to see everything, to understand the full scope of how completely I'd been excluded from this monumental chapter of his life. There were posts about dress fittings, cake tastings, bachelor party plans. Friends commenting with excitement about receiving the most beautiful invitations. Wedding planners tagged in posts about centerpieces and color schemes. A whole elaborate world had been spinning around my son's upcoming marriage, and I was the only one who didn't know it existed. The worst part wasn't just discovering the wedding. It was seeing how happy he looked in every single photograph. This wasn't a man who was conflicted about excluding his mother. This was a man who had moved on completely, as if the first 31 years of his life had never happened. I tried calling him immediately, my fingers stumbling over the familiar number I'd dialed thousands of times. The phone rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. His recorded voice, cheerful and professional, felt like a mockery. "You've reached Michael Patterson. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible." "Michael, it's Mom," I said, my voice cracking. "I saw Martha's post. I know about the wedding. Please call me back. We need to talk about this." I hung up and waited. 1 hour. 2 hours. By evening, my phone remained silent. The next morning, I called his office. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced professional tone, informed me that Mr. Patterson was in meetings all day and wouldn't be available. When I asked to leave an urgent message, she politely took my information but couldn't guarantee when he'd return the call. I tried his cell phone again. Voicemail. I sent a text message. "Michael, I know you're busy, but this is important. Your mother needs to speak with you." No response. The silence stretched into a second day, then a third. Each unanswered call felt like another door slamming shut between us. I found myself checking my phone compulsively, hoping for any sign that my son remembered I existed. That's when Martha called, her voice tentative and concerned. Eleanor, honey, I hope you don't mind that I tagged you in those photos. I was just so excited about Michael's big day. Martha, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, what do you know about this wedding? There was a pause that spoke volumes. Oh dear, she said softly. You do know about the wedding, right? I mean, of course you know. You're his mother. Tell me what you know, I repeated, my heart sinking even further. Well, the invitations went out about 6 weeks ago. Beautiful things. All gold embossing and thick cardstock. Very expensive looking. I just assumed you'd gotten one too. I even mentioned to Michael at the grocery store last month how excited I was to see you there. My blood turned to ice water. What did he say? He seemed surprised that I'd mentioned you. Said something about the guest list being complicated. I thought maybe there was some family drama I didn't know about, so I didn't push it. Family drama. As if I was some estranged relative who'd caused problems instead of the mother who'd sacrificed everything to raise him. That evening, Michael finally called. But instead of the warm, apologetic voice I was hoping for, I heard a stranger, cold, distant, and clearly annoyed at having to deal with this inconvenience. Mom, he said, and even that single word felt different. Formal. Detached. I got your messages. Michael, thank God. I've been so worried. I saw about the wedding, and I don't understand why. I meant to call you sooner, he interrupted, his tone suggesting this was a business call he wanted to finish quickly. Things have just been incredibly busy with work and the wedding planning. But Michael, why didn't you tell me? Why am I finding out about your wedding on social media? Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice carried a rehearsed quality that made my stomach turn. Jessica and I decided to keep things small. Very intimate. Just immediate family and a few close friends. The lie hit me like a physical blow. I'd seen the photos. Hundreds of guests. An enormous venue. Elaborate preparations that had been going on for months. Small. I whispered. Michael, I've seen the pictures. That country club. All those people. It's just how Jessica wanted it, he said, and there was something in his voice. Not guilt, but finality. As if this decision was beyond discussion or appeal. I'm your mother, I said, my voice breaking. How can you get married without your own mother there? I have to go, Mom. We'll talk later. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in my quiet house with the devastating realization that I hadn't just been excluded from a wedding. I had been erased. Completely and deliberately removed from my son's life as if I'd never mattered at all. But as I sat there in that crushing silence, something shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, raw and bleeding, but underneath it, a different emotion was building. Anger. Pure, righteous fury at being cast aside like yesterday's newspaper. If Michael thought he could simply delete me from his life for the sake of some woman's preferences, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. I booked the flight to Chicago that very night, my arthritic fingers moving with newfound purpose across the computer keyboard. The ticket cost more than I'd spent on myself in months, but I didn't care. Some things are worth every penny, and getting answers from my son was one of them. The small hotel near O'Hare was nothing fancy, but it served my needs. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, rehearsing what I'd say when I saw him. By morning, my resolve had crystallized into something unbreakable. I dressed carefully in my navy blue dress, the same one I'd worn to Bob's funeral, and fastened the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. If I was going to crash my son's wedding, I'd do it with dignity. The taxi ride to the Lakeshire Country Club took 40 minutes through Chicago's sprawling suburbs. As we drove, I watched the neighborhoods grow more expensive, the houses larger, the landscaping more elaborate. This wasn't just wealth. This was generational money, the kind that builds empires and crushes anyone who gets in the way. The country club emerged from behind a wall of manicured hedges like something from a movie set. The circular driveway was lined with luxury cars that probably cost more than my house, gleaming Bentleys, pristine Mercedes, a few Ferraris that looked like they'd been polished with diamonds. Valets in crisp uniforms moved between them with practiced efficiency. I paid the taxi driver and stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway, immediately feeling like I'd landed on an alien planet. The entrance was framed by towering columns draped in white silk and cascading orchids. A red carpet led up marble steps to doors that looked heavy enough to guard a fortress. Every step sent sharp pain through my swollen knees, but I kept moving. The weight of my purse felt reassuring against my shoulder. Inside was my phone, my identification, and every ounce of maternal determination I'd built up over 67 years. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and crystal, with ceilings that soared 3 stories high. Fresh flower arrangements the size of small trees filled every corner, their perfume so intense it was almost overwhelming. Everything gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that only massive amounts of money can buy. I could hear music and laughter echoing from the ballroom, the sound of 400 people celebrating something I should have been part of. Taking a deep breath that tasted like expensive air freshener, I walked toward those sounds, toward the moment that would change everything. And that brought me to where this story began. Standing in that ballroom doorway, watching 400 strangers turn to stare at the uninvited mother in her funeral dress. But now you know how I got there. Now you understand the journey that led to this moment of reckoning. Michael stood frozen near that ice sculpture, his face drained of all color. Up close, I could see he'd lost weight since I'd last seen him. His tuxedo, clearly custom-made and probably worth more than my monthly budget, hung slightly loose on his frame. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Mom," he whispered again, his voice carrying a mixture of terror and something that might have been relief. "You can't be here." "And yet here I am," I replied, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions swirling in my chest. Jessica appeared at his side like a beautiful predator sensing danger. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace that probably cost more than most people's cars. Every detail was perfect. Her hair, her makeup, her jewelry, but there was something cold in her green eyes that made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. What an unexpected surprise. The way she emphasized that last word made it clear she considered my presence an unwelcome intrusion rather than any kind of pleasant surprise. "I imagine it is," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "Considering I wasn't invited to my own son's wedding." A murmur rippled through the nearby guests. I could feel hundreds of eyes boring into us, could practically hear the whispered speculation spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Michael grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly tight. "Please, Mom. Let's go somewhere private. We can't do this here." "No," I said firmly, not moving an inch. "I'm not going anywhere until you explain to me how you could do this. How you could plan the most important day of your life and leave out the woman who gave you life." That's when he appeared, a tall, imposing man with silver-streaked hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. He moved through the crowd like he owned not just this country club, but possibly the entire world. His tuxedo was impeccable, his bearing regal, and his eyes were the coldest things I'd ever seen. "Jessica, darling," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow managed to be both smooth and threatening. "Is there a problem here?" This had to be Alistair Whitmore, Jessica's father, the man whose money had paid for this elaborate spectacle. Jessica's composure flickered for just a moment. "Daddy, this is Michael's mother. She was just leaving." "No, I wasn't," I said, standing my ground despite the pain shooting through my knees. "I was just getting started." Alistair's gaze settled on me with the weight of a judge passing sentence. He didn't speak to me directly. Instead, he addressed Michael as if I were simply an obstacle to be removed. "Michael, we have a schedule to keep. The minister is ready to begin the ceremony." I watched my son's face carefully, looking for some sign of the boy I'd raised, the man who used to call me every night just to hear my voice. What I saw instead broke my heart all over again. Michael looked terrified. Not angry, not annoyed, genuinely frightened. His eyes darted between me, Jessica, and Alistair like a trapped animal looking for escape routes that didn't exist. "I know this looks bad, Mom," he said, his voice shaking. "But you don't understand the situation." "Then help me understand," I demanded, my voice rising above the whispered conversations surrounding us. "Explain to me how the son I raised, the boy I sacrificed everything for, could stand here and pretend I don't exist." Alistair stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of expensive cologne mixed with something that smelled like menace. "Mrs. Patterson, I think it's best if you leave quietly. This is a private family celebration." "Family?" I laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the elegant atmosphere like a knife. I'm his family. I'm his mother. Who exactly are you to tell me I don't belong at my son's wedding? The silence that followed was deafening. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. 400 people held their collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. That's when Michael's shoulders slumped in defeat, and he said the words that changed everything. It wasn't my decision, Mom. His voice was barely a whisper, but in that silent ballroom, everyone heard him. The investment, the merger, it was all contingent on the deal being approved by Jessica's father. He told me that for everything to go through, I needed to prove I was fully committed to this new life, that I had left my past behind. Drop a comment if you think Eleanor should have walked away right then, because what happened next revealed the true depths of this betrayal. Alistair's face remained perfectly composed, but I saw something flicker in those cold eyes, satisfaction perhaps, that the truth was finally out in the open. Business is business, Eleanor, he said, finally acknowledging my existence. Family connections can be complicated. Michael understands that successful people sometimes have to make difficult choices. I stared at my son, unable to process what I was hearing. You traded me away? Your own mother? For a business deal. It's not that simple, Michael started, but I cut him off. It is exactly that simple. I shouted, my voice echoing off the marble walls. You sold our relationship, our history, everything we meant to each other, for money. Jessica's perfect mask finally slipped completely. Oh, for heaven's sake, she snapped, her voice sharp and cruel. Did you really think he was going to drag some small-town nobody to events like this? Look around you. This is our world now, not some pathetic little desert town where nothing ever happens. The cruelty in her words hit me like a physical blow, but they also revealed something important. This wasn't love. This was ownership. Michael hadn't found a partner, he'd been purchased, just like everything else in this gaudy display of wealth. And in that moment, looking at my son's stricken face, I realized he was as much a victim as I was. But just as I was processing this revelation, something else caught my attention. Something that would prove far more important than Jessica's cruel words or Alistair's cold manipulation. In my peripheral vision, I spotted a woman who clearly didn't belong in this palace of wealth and privilege. She stood near the edge of the crowd, partially hidden behind a massive floral arrangement, clutching what looked like a large manila envelope against her chest like it contained her most precious possessions. She was dressed in a simple gray dress that looked like something you'd find at a department store clearance rack, not the designer gowns that adorned every other woman in that ballroom. Her hair was pulled back in a plain ponytail, no elaborate styling or expensive jewelry. She looked nervous, almost frightened, her eyes darting around the room as if she was searching for someone or something. What struck me most was how out of place she seemed. This wasn't a wedding guest who'd underdressed for the occasion. This was someone who had no business being at a society wedding at all. But it was Jessica's reaction that made my detective instincts kick into high gear. The moment Jessica's gaze landed on the woman in gray, her face went white as her wedding dress. For just a split second, that perfect composure cracked completely, revealing something I'd never seen in her green eyes before, pure, undiluted panic. Jessica grabbed Michael's arm so tightly I could see her knuckles turning white through her elegant gloves. We need to start the ceremony now, she hissed, her voice urgent and sharp. Right now. But the photographer wanted to get more. Michael started. Now. Jessica snapped, loud enough that several nearby guests turned to stare. Alistair must have caught the edge in his daughter's voice, because his cold gaze followed hers to the woman in gray. When he spotted her, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He leaned down to whisper something in Jessica's ear, and I watched as her panic transformed into something that looked like determination mixed with fear. Excuse me, Alistair said smoothly, his voice betraying nothing of the tension I'd just witnessed. I need to handle a small matter. Michael, why don't you escort your mother to the lobby while Jessica and I take care of this? But I wasn't about to be dismissed that easily. My years of raising a curious, sometimes troublesome son had taught me to recognize when something important was being hidden from me. And whatever was in that envelope, whatever had caused Jessica to react with such fear, was definitely something I needed to understand. Actually, I said, my voice steady and determined, I think I'll stay and enjoy the party a little longer. After all, I came all this way. Before anyone could object, I turned and walked directly toward the woman in gray, my arthritic knees protesting every step but my resolve stronger than any physical pain. I could hear Jessica's sharp intake of breath behind me, could practically feel Alistair's cold stare boring into my back, but I didn't slow down. Whatever secret they were trying to protect was about to be exposed, and I had a feeling it was going to explain a lot more than just why I hadn't been invited to this wedding. The woman saw me approaching and took a step backward, pressing herself against the wall as if she wanted to disappear entirely. Up close, I could see she was probably in her 50s, with kind eyes that looked like they'd seen too much sadness. The envelope in her hands was thick, bulging with what looked like documents and photographs. "Excuse me," I said gently, not wanting to frighten her further. "I'm Eleanor Patterson, Michael's mother. You look like you might be as confused by all this as I am." She glanced nervously over my shoulder, probably checking to see if Jessica or Alistair were watching. I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "I just needed to find someone to give them this." She clutched the envelope tighter. "What's in there?" I asked, my curiosity overriding any sense of politeness. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "The truth," she said simply. "About what they did to my husband. About what they're doing to your son." My blood turned cold. "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, I heard Alistair's voice behind me, smooth as silk but with an underlying edge that made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Patterson, I really must insist that you return to the main reception area." I turned to face him, noticing that Jessica had positioned herself strategically to block any view of our conversation from the other guests. They were clearly desperate to keep whatever this woman knew from becoming public knowledge. "I'm having a lovely conversation," I replied pleasantly, though my heart was racing. "I'll be along in just a moment." The woman in gray looked absolutely terrified now, her eyes wide as she stared at Alistair. I could see her whole body trembling, and I realized that whatever she knew about this family, it was dangerous enough to make her genuinely fear for her safety. "I have to go," she whispered to me, then louder to Alistair. "I'm sorry for intruding. I was just leaving." But as she turned to walk away, I made a split-second decision that would change everything. I grabbed her arm gently and said, "Wait, meet me in 10 minutes. The ladies' room by the coat check." She nodded almost imperceptibly, then hurried away, clutching that mysterious envelope like her life depended on it. Alistair's cold eyes followed her retreat, then settled back on me with an intensity that made me grateful we were surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. "I trust we can return to celebrating my daughter's wedding now?" "Of course," I said sweetly. "Wouldn't want to miss a moment of this joyous occasion." But as I walked back toward the main reception, my mind was racing. Whatever was in that envelope had scared Jessica badly enough to demand an immediate ceremony. It had made Alistair abandon his composed facade for just a moment. And it had something to do with what they were doing to my son. I spent the next few minutes making polite small talk with confused wedding guests, all while watching the clock and planning my escape to that lady's room. Michael kept shooting worried glances in my direction, clearly torn between his loyalty to Jessica and his concern for me. When 10 minutes had passed, I excused myself and made my way through the maze of elegant corridors toward the coat check area. The ladies' room was tucked away in a quiet corner, away from the main reception noise. I found her there, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The moment she saw me, she pressed the envelope into my hands. "My name is Beatrice Coleman," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "My husband David was Alistair Whitmore's business partner 15 years ago. They started a tech company together, built it from nothing into something worth millions." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "Then Alistair decided he didn't want a partner anymore. He systematically destroyed my husband's life, forged documents to make it look like David was embezzling, hid assets, stole patents that were rightfully half David's. My husband tried to fight back, but Alistair had more money, better lawyers, more connections." My hands tightened on the envelope as the full horror of what she was telling me began to sink in. "David died 3 years ago," Beatrice continued, her voice breaking. "The stress, the legal battles, losing everything we'd worked for. It killed him. And Jessica," her voice hardened. She wasn't some innocent daughter who didn't know what daddy was doing. She was his right hand, helping forge signatures, manipulating bank records, destroying evidence. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with secrets that could destroy lives. "What's in here?" "Everything," Beatrice whispered. "Bank records, emails, copies of the forged documents, photographs of Jessica with the people who helped them steal David's company. Enough evidence to send both of them to prison for the rest of their lives." My mind reeled as the full scope of what I was holding hit me. This wasn't just about corporate greed or business rivalry. This was about murder, maybe not with a gun or a knife, but murder all the same. And my son was about to marry into this family of criminals. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears again. "Because I've been watching them for months, trying to figure out how to expose them without ending up like David. And then I realized what they're doing to your son is exactly what they did to my husband. Except this time, they're being smarter about it." The room seemed to spin around me. "What do you mean?" "Michael's company, his assets, his reputation. They need all of it to cover up their crimes. The merger Jessica keeps talking about? It's not about love or building a future together. It's about accessing clean money to hide their dirty transactions. Once they have control of his company, your son will be the perfect fall guy when the authorities finally catch up to them." I staggered backward, the full horror of the situation hitting me like a physical blow. Michael wasn't just being manipulated into cutting ties with his family. He was being set up to take the blame for years of corporate crimes he knew nothing about. He wasn't a bad son who'd abandoned his mother for social status. He was a victim, walking blindly into a trap that would destroy his life just as completely as it had destroyed David Coleman's. With trembling fingers, I opened the manila envelope that Beatrice had pressed into my hands. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, as if the secrets inside were made of lead instead of paper. The first document I pulled out was a bank statement dated 18 months ago, showing massive withdrawals from accounts bearing the name Coleman Whitmore Technologies. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred to offshore accounts I'd never heard of. "David built that company from nothing," Beatrice whispered, her voice thick with grief and rage. "He was the tech genius, the one with the innovative ideas. Alistair was supposed to handle the business side, but what he really handled was stealing everything David created." I flipped through more papers, each one more damning than the last. Email printouts showing Jessica coordinating with lawyers to forge David's signature on documents that signed away his rights to patents he'd developed. Bank transfer authorizations that moved millions of dollars out of company accounts, all bearing forged signatures that looked remarkably like David's handwriting. Jessica wasn't some innocent daughter caught up in her father's schemes, Beatrice continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. She was his partner in crime. "Look at those emails. She's the one who suggested moving the stolen assets to the Cayman Islands. She's the one who recommended hiring that lawyer who specialized in corporate fraud." One email in particular made my blood run cold. It was from Jessica to someone named Marcus Chen, dated just 2 years ago. "Daddy's getting nervous about the Coleman investigation. We need another clean company to fold our assets into, something with an impeccable reputation and a CEO we can control completely. Do you know anyone who fits that description? Someone ambitious enough to be flattered by our attention, but naive enough not to ask too many questions." The response, sent 3 days later, made my knees go weak. "What about Michael Patterson at Chicago Investment Partners? Young, hungry, recently lost his father, so he's emotionally vulnerable. His company has exactly the kind of clean reputation you need, and from what I can tell, he's the type who'd be impressed by your family's wealth and social connections." I had to sit down on the small velvet chair in the corner of the ladies' room. The full scope of their manipulation was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. They hadn't just happened to meet my son at some social event. They had targeted him specifically, researched his vulnerabilities, and crafted an elaborate seduction designed to gain access to his company and his assets. "Michael never had a chance, did he?" I whispered, more to myself than to Beatrice. "None of them do," she replied grimly. "That's how the Whitmores operate. They identify successful people with something they want, a company, a patent, a reputation, and then they systematically destroy them while taking everything they've worked for." I continued reading through the documents, each page revealing new layers of deception. Financial records showed that Whitmore Industries was hemorrhaging money, propped up only by the assets they'd stolen from David and other victims over the years. They were essentially running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using each new victim's wealth to cover up the evidence of previous crimes. But the most chilling document was a merger agreement template, clearly prepared months before Michael and Jessica had even announced their engagement. It outlined how Michael's company would be absorbed into Whitmore Industries, with all assets transferred to accounts controlled exclusively by Alistair and Jessica. They're not just stealing his company, I realized with growing horror. They're setting him up to take the blame for all their previous crimes. Beatrice nodded grimly. Once the merger goes through, they'll start moving their dirty money through his company's accounts. When the authorities finally catch up, and they will, because I'm not the only one investigating them, all the evidence will point to Michael as the mastermind. The room felt like it was spinning. My son, my brilliant, trusting son, was about to sign his name to documents that would make him legally responsible for decades of financial crimes. And he had no idea. How long do we have? I asked, my voice barely audible. The merger papers are supposed to be signed tonight, after the ceremony. Jessica insisted on doing it as part of the wedding celebration, said it would be romantic to officially combine their business lives with their personal ones. I looked at my watch. It was already past 7 o'clock. The ceremony was supposed to start at 8, with the reception immediately following. That gave me less than 3 hours to somehow convince my son that the woman he was about to marry was a criminal who was planning to destroy his life. But as I stared at the damning evidence in my hands, I realized the impossibility of my situation. Michael was so deeply under their influence, so convinced that Alistair and Jessica represented his ticket to a better life, that he'd already chosen them over his own mother. How could I possibly make him see the truth when he'd been conditioned to view me as an obstacle to his success? There's more, Beatrice said quietly, pulling out a photograph from the bottom of the envelope. This was taken 6 months ago. The image showed Jessica and Michael at what looked like a romantic dinner, but Jessica's attention wasn't on her supposedly beloved fiancé. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression of cold satisfaction, as if she was posing for a trophy photo. Michael, meanwhile, gazed at her with obvious adoration, completely unaware that he was staring at someone who viewed him as nothing more than a useful tool. She doesn't love him, I whispered, though I'd suspected as much from her behavior in the ballroom. She doesn't love anyone, Beatrice replied. Love requires empathy, and people like Jessica and Alistair are incapable of that. They see other human beings as resources to be exploited, nothing more. The weight of the envelope in my hands had transformed from physical heaviness to emotional burden. This wasn't just evidence of corporate crime, it was proof that my son was in mortal danger, not just from financial ruin but from the complete destruction of everything he'd worked to build. But more than that, it was proof that I was the only person in the world who could save him. The Eleanor who had walked into this bathroom 10 minutes ago hurt, confused, seeking only to understand why she'd been excluded from her son's wedding, no longer existed. In her place stood a mother with a mission, armed with the truth and absolutely determined to protect her child from the predators who had ensnared him. I carefully placed all the documents back in the envelope, sealing away the evidence that would either save Michael's life or destroy mine in the attempt. What do you need me to do? I asked Beatrice. Get this to the authorities, but not until after you've gotten your son away from them, she replied. If they realize what we know before Michael is safe, they'll find a way to make sure he takes the fall for everything. These people don't just ruin lives, they end them. The bathroom door opened, and we both froze as one of the wedding guests entered. Beatrice quickly moved to the mirror, pretending to fix her hair while I stepped into a stall, clutching the envelope against my chest. When the woman left, Beatrice turned to me one final time. Be careful, Eleanor. David thought he could outsmart them too. They're not just criminals. They're sophisticated manipulators who've had years to perfect their methods. Don't underestimate how dangerous they can be when cornered. With that warning echoing in my ears, I tucked the envelope securely into my purse and prepared to return to the ballroom. But I wasn't the same woman who had crashed this wedding seeking answers about a missing invitation. I was a mother on a mission to save her son's life, and I'd rather die trying than watch them destroy him the way they'd destroyed David Coleman. I walked back into that ballroom with the confidence of a woman who held the power to destroy empires in her purse. The envelope containing Beatrice's evidence felt like it was burning against my side, but my steps were steady, my resolve unshakable. The wedding ceremony had been delayed, probably while Alistair and Jessica tried to figure out what Beatrice had been doing there and whether their carefully constructed facade was in danger. I could see them huddled near the altar with the wedding planner, Jessica's perfect composure showing hairline cracks of stress. Michael stood alone by the champagne fountain, looking lost and confused. The confident groom from earlier had been replaced by a man who seemed to sense that something was terribly wrong but couldn't identify what. I made my way through the crowd of designer-dressed guests, many of whom were probably Alistair's business associates, people who had no idea they were celebrating the wedding of Chicago's most sophisticated criminals. The irony was almost poetic. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying across the marble floors and crystal chandeliers with surprising strength. "Before this beautiful ceremony begins, I believe there's something everyone should know about the happy couple." The string quartet stopped playing. Conversations died mid-sentence. 400 faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to horror to barely concealed annoyance at this disruption of their elegant evening. Jessica's face went white as bone china. "Security," she hissed to someone near the entrance, but I was already moving toward the center of the room, toward the small raised platform where the couple was supposed to exchange vows. "Michael," I said, my voice gentle but carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "I need you to listen to me. Really listen. Your life depends on it." Alistair stepped forward, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Mrs. Patterson, you've disrupted this celebration enough. I'm asking you nicely to leave before I have you removed." "By all means, call security," I replied, pulling the manila envelope from my purse and holding it high enough for everyone to see. "But first, let me share what's in here. Let me tell everyone about David Coleman." The effect was instantaneous. Alistair's composed facade cracked like ice under pressure. Jessica made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a snarl. And several guests in expensive suits suddenly looked very uncomfortable, as if that name meant something to them too. "That's enough," Jessica screamed, abandoning all pretense of bridal elegance. "You bitter old woman. You can't stand that your son chose me over you, so you're trying to ruin everything." But I ignored her theatrics and focused on my son. "Michael, the woman you're about to marry helped destroy a man named David Coleman. She and her father systematically stole his company, forged his signature on documents, and moved millions of dollars to offshore accounts. David died 3 years ago from the stress of what they did to him." "That's a lie," Jessica shrieked, but her voice was shrill with panic rather than righteous indignation. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first document, a bank statement showing the massive transfers from Coleman Whitmore Technologies. "This is a lie? These bank records showing your signature authorizing the theft of David's assets." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw phones being pulled out, cameras being raised. This story was about to go far beyond this ballroom. Michael stared at the document I was holding, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "Jessica, what is she talking about? Don't listen to her," Jessica snapped. "She's making this up to hurt us." But I was already pulling out more evidence. Here's an email from Jessica to her lawyer, discussing how to forge David Coleman's signature. Here's another one where she suggests moving stolen assets to the Cayman Islands. I held up the photograph of Jessica looking coldly satisfied while Michael gazed at her with adoration. "And here's what she really thinks of you, Michael. You're nothing but a useful tool to her." The crowd was pressing closer now, trying to see the documents, trying to hear every word. I could see Alistair desperately signaling to someone near the back of the room, probably those security guards Jessica had called for. "Michael," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation, "they didn't meet you by chance. They researched you, targeted you specifically because your company has the clean reputation they need to hide their crimes. This whole relationship has been a setup from day one." "Shut up," Jessica screamed, her beautiful face twisted with rage. "Just shut up, you pathetic old bat." But Michael was staring at her now with an expression I'd never seen before, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Jessica, tell me she's lying. Tell me this isn't true." For a moment, Jessica seemed to realize that her mask had completely slipped. She tried to soften her expression, to reclaim some of her earlier charm. Michael, darling, you can't possibly believe. Tell him about the merger papers, I interrupted, pulling out that damning contract template. Tell him how you plan to transfer all his assets to your father's accounts tonight. Tell him how you were going to make him legally responsible for decades of your family's crimes. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked from me to Jessica to the document in my hands, and I could see the exact moment when the truth finally penetrated the web of lies they'd spun around him. You were going to frame me, he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying in that crystal-clear silence. And that's when Jessica's true nature exploded into full view. Oh, for crying out loud, she snarled, her elegant wedding dress suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit. Yes, you idiot. Did you really think someone like me would marry someone like you for love? You were supposed to be the perfect mark, ambitious enough to be flattered by our attention, stupid enough not to ask the right questions. The collective gasp from 400 wedding guests was like a physical force. Phones were definitely recording now. This moment was being captured from dozens of angles, soon to be shared across every social media platform in existence. Michael staggered backward as if she'd physically struck him. You never loved me. Love. Jessica laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I loved your company's assets. I loved your clean reputation that we could hide behind. I loved how easily you believed every lie we told you. But you're nothing but a small-town nobody who got lucky in business. The perfect, useful idiot. Smash that subscribe button if you think Eleanor is the hero we all need, because what happened next was justice served on a silver platter. The room erupted into chaos. Guests were shouting, some pushing toward the exits, others pressing closer to get better video footage. I could see Alistair frantically speaking into his phone, probably calling lawyers or trying to figure out how to contain this nuclear explosion of their carefully constructed image. But it was too late. The truth was out, recorded on dozens of phones, witnessed by hundreds of Chicago's social elite. There would be no covering this up, no spinning it as the ramblings of a bitter mother-in-law. Security guards were finally pushing through the crowd toward me, but the damage was done. I held the envelope high above my head like a trophy. Everything you need to put these criminals in prison is right here. I shouted. David Coleman's murder was just the beginning. Jessica lunged toward me with her hands outstretched like claws, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a ghost of her former elegance. Give me that. But Michael stepped between us, his face a mask of cold fury that reminded me exactly of his father when someone tried to hurt our family. Don't you dare touch my mother. The words hit Jessica like a slap. She stared at him with genuine shock, as if she couldn't believe he was choosing me over her after everything they'd invested in controlling him. Your mother, she spat. That pathetic old woman who lives in some desert nowhere? You're choosing her over everything we could have given you. She's worth 100 of you, Michael said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of that ballroom. And apparently, she's the only person who loved me enough to save me from making the biggest mistake of my life. The wedding was over. The carefully orchestrated merger was over. The Whitmore family's reputation was over. And as I watched Jessica's perfect world crumble around her, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years, the fierce satisfaction of a mother who had successfully protected her child from predators. In the chaos that followed, as security guards struggled to restore order and guests fled the ballroom clutching their phones full of scandalous footage, Michael stood frozen in the center of it all. The man who had been so confident, so sure of his choices just hours earlier, now looked like a lost child who had just awakened from a terrible nightmare. Jessica and Alistair had vanished in the confusion, probably slipping out through some back exit while their lawyers figured out how to handle the legal avalanche that was about to bury them. The elaborate wedding setup remained behind like the ruins of a beautiful lie. Wilted flowers, abandoned champagne glasses, and a 3-tier cake that no one would ever cut. I walked over to my son, stepping carefully through the debris of his shattered world. Up close, I could see his hands trembling, could see the tears he was fighting to hold back. This strong, successful man had been reduced to someone who didn't know what was real anymore. Mom, he whispered, and his voice cracked like he was 12 years old again and had just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Then the dam burst. Michael collapsed into my arms, his shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep in his soul. 3 years of manipulation, months of lies, and hours of devastating revelation all poured out of him at once. I was so stupid, he choked out between tears. How could I have been so blind? How could I choose them over you? I held him the way I used to when he was small, and the world seemed too big and frightening to handle alone. My arthritic hands stroked his hair, and for a moment, we weren't in an elaborate country club ballroom surrounded by scandal and chaos. We were just a mother comforting her child. You weren't stupid, sweetheart, I said softly. You were targeted by professionals. They spent months studying you, learning exactly what to say and do to make you trust them. Even the smartest people can fall for that kind of calculated manipulation. But I hurt you, he said, pulling back to look at me with red-rimmed eyes. I made you feel like you didn't matter, like our entire relationship meant nothing. How can you forgive me? I cupped his face in my swollen hands, looking into eyes that were finally clear of the fog that had surrounded him for so long. Because that's what mothers do, Michael. We love unconditionally, even when it hurts. Even when we're pushed away. Even when we have to fight our way back into our children's lives. He hugged me again, this time with the desperate intensity of someone who had almost lost everything that truly mattered. I missed you so much, Mom. I didn't realize how much until right now, but I missed talking to you, missed your advice, missed just knowing you were there. Over the next hour, as the ballroom gradually emptied and the country club staff began the grim task of cleaning up the remains of the century's most spectacular wedding disaster, Michael told me everything. How Jessica had slowly isolated him from his old friends, convincing him they weren't sophisticated enough for his new social circle. How Alistair had made him believe that success meant cutting ties with anything that reminded him of his modest background. They made me feel ashamed of where I came from, he admitted. Ashamed of our little house in Scottsdale, of Dad's memory of you. They convinced me that to be worthy of Jessica's love, I had to become someone completely different. But you were already worthy, I told him. You were always worthy, just as you were. We spent that night in a quiet hotel room near the airport, ordering room service pizza like we used to do during his college breaks, talking until the sun came up. Michael wanted to know everything. How I discovered the truth, why I decided to come to Chicago, what had given me the courage to stand up to people as powerful as the Whitmores. I was terrified, I admitted. My knees were killing me. I felt completely out of place in that fancy ballroom, and I had no idea if anyone would believe me. But then I realized that sometimes, when someone you love is in danger, being terrified doesn't matter. Being a mother means showing up anyway. The flight back to Scottsdale the next afternoon was nothing like the tense, lonely journey I'd made to Chicago just days earlier. Michael sat beside me, holding my hand during takeoff the way he used to as a little boy, and we talked about everything and nothing. His work, my arthritis, the desert sunsets he'd missed, the quiet peace of our little neighborhood that he was finally ready to appreciate again. I want to move back, he said as we descended toward Phoenix. Not permanently, but I want to get a place here too. I want to be close enough to have dinner with you once a week, to help you with whatever you need, to remember who I really am. As we landed and I looked out at the familiar landscape of my home, the red rocks, the sprawling desert, the endless sky that had always made problems seem smaller and love seem bigger, I realized that this story hadn't been about revenge at all. It had been about redemption. About the power of unconditional love to survive manipulation, betrayal, and even our own worst mistakes. It had been about a mother's willingness to fight for her child, no matter how far he'd wandered or how much it hurt to bring him home. Sometimes a mother has to show up uninvited, unannounced, and unwelcome to remind her child that they are never truly alone. Sometimes love means crashing through the lies that other people build around the ones we care about. And sometimes, the most important thing we can do is refuse to give up on someone, even when they've given up on themselves. What started as the worst betrayal of my life had become its greatest triumph. From the ashes of a destroyed wedding came something far more valuable, the restoration of the bond between a mother and son that no amount of money or manipulation could ever truly break. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to fight to save someone you love from their own bad decisions? Do you believe in the power of second chances when family is involved? Because sometimes, the greatest love story isn't between two lovers, It's between a parent and child who find their way back to each other against all odds.